but a brilliant filmmaker
Dr.
who
Jen Lindsay.
Dr. Jen Lindsay. She doesn't throw her PhD around like someone else does.
Well, LeBron is Dr.
Dude,
Doctor, and I believe that he does throw both of those around.
That is a weekly
like at the gun
fixture.
show.
So director, producer, and also Dr. Jen Lindsay, who created the Simulating Religious Violence documentary or
Yes,
film?
documentary.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll stop giving a terrible introduction, and would love to hear your introduction of the film for those who have absolutely zero context on what Culture Pulse is, on what the studies were. Would love to hear your elevator version of it.
That's for me? Sure, great.
Yes.
So Simulating Religious Violence is a documentary feature film about a group of computer scientists working with a group of religion scholars to develop a cutting-edge technology to use the power of computer simulation and modeling to better understand religious radicalization and mutually escalating xenophobic violence. And the film follows these scientists, this motley crew of specialists, as they journey from Boston, less than a mile away from the finish line of the Boston Marathon bombing, and down to Virginia to work out of the Virginia Modeling Analysis and Simulation Center, and then on over to Norway at the University of Agder with the Center for Modeling
Social Systems.
Social Systems, that's right. And the film actually also follows the scientists to the Greek island of Lesbos, where they tour the refugee camps and try to understand the relationship between religious extremism and the refugee crisis, and also the fact that second-generation immigrants are statistically more vulnerable to radicalization processes. So along the way, these scientists work together to try and harness different data on aspects of the migrant crisis and radicalization processes, all grounded in decades of social scientific research on identities and tribal behaviors and the power of ideas to bind people together. And they build loosely predictive, agent-based, and systems dynamics models to try and understand aspects of society that might increase the possibility of radicalization and violence in different social settings. So the movie follows that adventure and follows the big important question for many of us as to whether you can actually take specialized research out of the ivory tower and apply it productively to the real world to improve societies and people's experiences across social divides.
Love that end bit more than anything, because that has by and large been Justin and I's relationship for a decade, is trying to pull him out of the ivory tower, kicking and screaming. Would love to hear how you explain simulating societal simulation to people who are unfamiliar. How do you explain the utility of that? How do you explain what it is? How have you come to package that story?
Yeah, how do you tell a story out of this?
Great question. Yes, because life itself does not have a natural narrative structure. So in order to come up with an inciting incident and then progressive complications, that climax and a resolution, it literally has taken 6.5 years of work so far. But we're getting there. We've gotten there, I would think. So in terms of broaching the topic of simulation to people, there are a few different launch points for me. One is the very helpful 4th installation of the Matrix series, which has done a lot of heavy lifting to spread the idea of simulation into the pop culture imagination. And so when I say simulation, people say like the Matrix, and I say yes. And I also remind them that modeling a simulation actually is more present in their lives than they might have been aware of. Like people who are learning how to fly a plane often use a flight simulator. Surgeons try out complicated surgical techniques on dummies, which are models. if you're a city planner and you need to figure out what's it going to take to evacuate your city population in a certain amount of time if there's a tsunami or a catastrophic earthquake, you'll have to build a simulation of your roads and your exits and what are all the levers city planners need to be able to press in order to get people safely out of the city in a certain amount of time. So simulation is something that you would build in order to make a lot of those tests before entering the realm of real life. So, and for instance, if you're going to build a roller coaster, you simulate the physics of the gravity inherent in the roller coaster. Or if you're going to build an assembly line and you need to create X products in X amount of hours, and you need these many materials engaged and these many hands on the manufacturing process, a simulation is instrumental in that planning process. So once I start reminding people that simulation actually plays a big part in the way the world works on an everyday basis, people start to feel more comfortable. And then I also talk to them about a paper map. And I talk to them about how if they're following a roadmap, they want a clear demarcation of streets and avenues and major landmarks, but they don't want every single tree on that map, because then you couldn't find the street that you needed to find. You wouldn't really know how to get somewhere because it'd be too detailed, right? So I explain that the map is a purposeful abstraction of a way of getting from point A to point B without distracting you with too much complexity. And like that, a model is a purposeful abstraction of our social world that mathematically expresses relationships between social factors like one's education level and their vulnerability to being recruited by a charismatic religious leader. But we don't have to express every single detail about a person's life in order to productively simulate some kinds of behaviors that they would be statistically likely to engage in. So all of these different entry points have been useful for broaching the topic to people.
Justin, why have you been hiding Jen from us for 6 years?
She's been working on this documentary.
Yeah, I've been crying over a keyboard.
That was amazing. I love the breakdown and kind of specifically talking about like an assembly line, right? So an assembly line is something that is a linear. It's something that has a beginning and an end very clearly in your mind, visually, and just in every way that you can look at it. And when you look at societal simulation, it's a network structure. It's complex, and so people often, when we explain it at that end, can grasp the philosophy of it, the concept of it, the idea of it, but they struggle to touch it in their minds, so to speak. Like they just can't get to it. So I love that you remind people of all the simulations of which they are aware. I spent the last decade trying to explain what Justin was working on without using sci-fi references. Yes, Matrix for some people, but in boardrooms, oftentimes that's not well received. So finding different ways to explain it is helpful. It's very interesting that this educational component is so critical in having people accept the intelligence that comes out of it, and really kind of trusting in that wisdom. Have you found that has been a barrier in helping people to, I guess, buy into it as well?
I laugh ruefully when you use the word trust, because people immediately go toward this scenario of social engineering, right? Like these evil scientists are turning the knobs in order to figure out which populations need to be destroyed and removed from society in order to make society more peaceful or something. And one thing I'm always very happy to share with them is that one of the characteristics of this group that was constituted the Modeling Religion Project was modesty about the scope and applicability of their project. This question of whether you can take highly specialized, highly technical research out of the ivory tower and apply it to the real world is something that they were constantly very thoughtful about. And there was no megalomania happening on the team in terms of, asserting that they would be able to, reconstruct society or that they would solve all the problems. And in fact, it's funny, our simulating religious violence production team, we're having a crowdfunding campaign to raise some completion funds for the movie. Because if you have an ambitious distribution vision for a movie and you don't want to just throw it up on YouTube for free, We think this is a good story that deserves to be told and to reach a broad audience through television broadcast or a streaming platform. And in order to get there, you really have to spend a lot of money to make the experience of watching the movie perfect. So in terms of sound editing and color correction and everything just being perfectly refined. And also all of the money that goes into legal protections of the movie. Anyway, I'm sure we'll loop back to the crowdfunding campaign later,
Yeah.
hopefully. But I wanted to say that part of throwing a crowdfunding campaign is it's a very strategic, active communication about the film, and you run immediately into resistance on the topic of simulation and like the evils of social engineering, and you know when you crowdfund, you have to literally get in touch with every single person you've ever met in your life and ask them for money. And a lot of people that I've met in my life, like me, have been in sort of like a lefty, progressive milieu, and they'll write back to me, Unitarian Universalist minister friends and whatnot. They're like, I take issue with this film and the suggestion that you can use math and science to solve human problems, And I'm always happy to say, reply. Look, these are responsible, modest, scientific, sober thinkers, and they're not planning to engage in any sort of ethnic cleansing with science. And I have to talk people down because they go straight to, Dr. Mengele with a computer.
Yeah.
So yeah, trust is a really interesting issue when you start talking about simulation, especially when you're trying to use simulation to create something that we in the West conceive of as a better society. That is only one perspective of what a better society looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, and that I think that point was really the genesis of these talks. Was really just having these conversations in public and always making it an open discourse, because there is no one that can determine what should or should not be unless we all do that together. And that's kind of where this came from, was Justin and Laurent wanting to counterbalance with public opinion. And streaming it, we always get some really entertaining comments, but they're also by and large just very interested and curious, as was the research that created the system. And I think that curiosity of our own behavior is something that's very healthy societally. So it's always very interesting when you do hit those kind of points of objection, where people push back. And I think a lot of Justin, we've talked about lawmakers pushing back as well, but not necessarily because they object to the science, but because they're kind of reactive because they don't understand it. And so they don't,
Yeah.
they kind of have yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was gonna say that, one of the sort of like picking up like the footage that Jen has is really fascinating in a way, because it's kind of like the prequel to a lot of what we discuss here every week. It actually does. That was the first project where Laurent and I worked together on the project, and so it kind of discusses like the key and has very real footage, very raw footage of the first times of he and I working together to create simulations, and how we're discussing these things and how we think about these things and how we've built out some of our systems in the past. And then since then, Laurent and I have done a lot of forward-facing work on the public side. Excuse me. And trying to engage policymakers and stakeholders. And sort of since the filming wrapped on there, we presented our work to the European Commission on how you can use this to help resettle refugees, which has become increasingly pertinent in the last few weeks with the conflict in the Ukraine. We've discussed this with consultants in the ministries of defense in the United Kingdom, in other countries throughout Europe. And so, we're very active in that. One of the things I find interesting is the distance between the concerns of the public and the concerns of the politicians. Because my experience with the public facing stuff, it's very similar to what Jen just described. People immediately go to Cambridge Analytica, and not even like what really happened at Cambridge Analytica, but like sort of the version that MSNBC fed them of the sky is falling and they've got demon computers and all of this, just kind of this hyperbolic end of the world social engineering approach. But then when you talk to the politicians about it, they're more just like, I don't really understand this, and I can't really sell this. So it's not that they're not interested in it or that they're necessarily worried about the ethical risks that are involved, which is kind of more concerning than anything else, really. But they're very worried about the fact that if they can't easily explain these results, they can't back up why they support one policy over another. And so if they can't do that, then they're just not going to continue the conversation. It's just a waste of their time. They've got millions of people arguing for their time. And so if they need extra time, then that's all they're going to have. So that's one of those things that for me has been really interesting.
I also just put the link to the crowdfunding campaign in the chat. It's 70% funded with 14 days to go. Took me a little bit to find that.
I think you're talking to me. My connection just briefly dropped. So if you're addressing a question to me, if you wouldn't mind backing up to the beginning of the question.
No question.
Nope,
just saying
we're
that
good.
I posted to the audience that the crowdfunding campaign is now in the chat.
Thanks.
Yeah, it is interesting how, I guess enrollment, if we use that kind of paradigm, is like getting enrollment in a political conversation does require some degree of understanding. And so then it kind of breeds this question of like, well, how do you explain this more simply without undermining what it truly is? And it is, would you describe the simulation system as a complex system?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, not just in like the colloquial sense of the term, but even in like the scientific sense of what a complex system is, or a complex adaptive system. The simulations that we work with, particularly the multi-agent AI ones, those are by necessity complex adaptive systems. In the definition, you actually cannot have a multi-agent AI system that is not a complex adaptive system. So one of them kind of precludes the other in definition. But some of the simulations that we did in the documentary and for the project were more mathematical in nature. They were system dynamics models, and those are ultimately reducible to just systems of difference and differential equations. So it all just comes down to calculus, pretty much. And you can just kind of and so you can. You're just solving these equations as the different variables and subsystems of the overall system interact over time. And in those, it's not necessarily a complex adaptive system. It's complex in the sense that there are feedback loops, and you can get complex behaviors out of it, but it's not sort of complex in the sense that like evolution is complex, and that there's like these environmental factors that are inherently changing the states of individual actors inside the system. In the agent-based models and multi-agent AI systems, you do see that, though, which is one of the reasons why those are a little bit more powerful, I think, as predictors of social systems. But if you need a quick and dirty way of doing and understanding something that's got a lot of variables, doing it the mathematical way is also pretty useful.
Jen, what has been your experience in communicating these types of concepts previously? Have you done any other films, or was this the first? Like, what has been your experience in science communication, I guess is the best way?
Negatory. My experience, my experience is being a hustler who always says yes to a paid project. And when Wesley Wildman, the PI on the Modeling Religion Project, got in touch with me in 2015. I knew him because I was doing my PhD at Boston University in the religion department and the sociology of religion. And he knew that I had a background in documentary filmmaking. And he just opened his research institute, the Center for Mind and Culture. And he was like, nobody understands what the hell we're doing because it's super specialized. And we academic people don't know how to talk to like the general public at all. So Jen, you seem to straddle these two worlds. Do you think you could help us do a little visual storytelling, about what we're doing here at the Center for Mind and Culture? And at the time, so he started talking to me about that stuff, I think in 2013 or 2012. And at the time, I started making like tiny little sort of documentary summaries of projects in the fields of sociology of religion, cognitive science of religion, neurology of religion, et cetera. And so then
she disappeared.
She did. She's flickering.
She's coming in and out.
The internet.
There she is.
We can now. Yeah. We lost you at the neurology of religion.
Oh, okay, right. So lots of different lots of different disciplines engaged and interdisciplines in the study of religion. So I was helping them trying to express some of that specialized work to the general public. And in 2015, he gets in touch with me again and he says, hey, if I can find you the money, do you think you can tell a story about the application of modeling and simulation to the study of religion? And I said, yes. Oh, yes. I already have some ideas. Let me at it, Wes. And he said, great, I'll be right in touch with you with a budget. So we get off the call and I Google, like, what the F is computer simulation? And everything I could read about it made no sense to me, which I discovered was a great asset to storytelling about this project, because I knew all the questions that people would ask first. I knew the skepticism, I knew the urgency, I knew the concern, I knew like the snobby, reductive, simplified approach to it that people were likely to take. Because, you know, in the early days, I was definitely like, oh my God, these guys in khaki pants, they don't know anything about the world. Like, what are they going to do about these social problems? And the more that I talked to them, the more I really discovered that they were very, very careful in their questioning, very rigorous in their methodologies, very respectful of the data, and very aware of the skepticism that the broader public would bring to the project. And very appreciative of the ways in which I could push them to be clearer. It's funny, I realized at some point, because I was like, oh, a map is a purposeful abstraction of reality, so is a model, and so is a documentary film about simulation. It's a purposeful abstraction of the project itself. So the film is a model!
So is there a fourth wall in that sense, or are there no walls?
There is no spoon.
There is no spoon.
Can I hire Jen to be the voiceover for my inner monologue every time I'm in a conversation with you and
Yes,
Moran?
I already have some ideas. Is there budget?
I appreciate your enthusiasm for this.
Wait till you hear Brian's inner monologues and you're like, actually, I'm out. I'm in too deep.
No, the khaki
There's
pants
no
is
amount of
very on
money.
point.
It was.
So Jen, for context, Justin is the sole catalyst for my no dating academics policy, which was adamantly adhered to for a solid decade before I accidentally went on a date with my now wife, who just finished her PhD in human genetics.
Oops.
Yeah, there was a lot of healing around
at least a
neo-Darwinism in the
decade, I
beginning of
think.
our relationship.
Because when did you meet her?
2019.
Yes, it was it was 11 years.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Never went on a date with PhD.
Mm-hmm.
Technically, you didn't, because she didn't get your PhD until after you were married.
PhDC still counts. They still think the
ABD,
same way.
all but dissertation.
Yeah, exactly. It is really, we actually, kind of tangential story, but we actually just got back from a week in Temecula, or a weekend, sorry, in Temecula, at an event called a cabin. And it was a kind of like a gathering of friends with shared activities and a bunch of other stuff like that. But I think 60 or 65% of the people had PhDs, which was interesting. Probably about 50% of the people were burners, which made it more interesting. It was interesting because you have all these people who are kind of very intellectual, but at the same time, very self-critical in a seemingly reasonably productive way. And one of my favorites was one of the people who we'd met, who's quite lovely, really awesome, just kind of an interesting human being. We did these lightning talks just for fun, not recorded, just, to each other. And he brought up an hour-long talk that he did at a conference around mathematics that I cannot begin to comprehend or convey. And he basically roasted himself giving the talk.
Nice.
Of how poorly he was communicating, which was hilarious. And it was great because he's like, and here I did something with my hands that I'm not sure what that was intended to illustrate. And then he critiqued how he answered questions as being not helpful. And so it was really amazing to see someone who has something that's very complex, that's understood by a small group of people, who's very passionate about communicating it, in this process of comically and in jest trying to get better. And I think that in academia, there definitely is this, at least this assumption by those outside of it, speaking from my own eyes, that they're very stodgy and focused, and if you don't get it, then you're just too silly. But I think that that's not, that's definitely not 100% of the audience. And it's really awesome to see projects like this that are aimed at broadening that audience and showcasing that type of communication, so that more people can come to understand the things that exist in our world and that are known in our world, so that we're not afraid of them.
Yeah, I would say Jen has at least an hour's worth of footage of me making very academic-y, assholey remarks that could be critiqued at length. There's
Bloopers,
one
please.
phrase.
Things that the untutored layperson would never understand.
There's one phrase in particular that during an interview, I guess we were in Virginia. I can't remember what it was, but we had been doing this interview for a while, and I was trying to basically say that it's, we need to make these things understandable for everyone. But the phrase that I used was the untutored lay people. To which Jen said in a meeting later that day, yeah, I got a lot of good feedback and footage of you guys today. Some of it's usable, some of it's really not. And she was like, Justin, particularly that interview where you said something about untutored lay people. I was like, yeah, I said what? And she was like, you said untutored for the next 2 years of the project. That became one of the running jokes, was just like, oh, it's gonna be so easy, an untutored layperson could get it. And I think there's a blooper reel in the film actually where it's
there
like
is a blooper
Wesley
reel
Wildman, one of the heads of the project, is using it too. Yeah.
Because he also says things like, well, it's hard to explain to you, Jen.
He does.
Yeah, it's funny, like this idea of science communication, like there's science, but there's also communication, and that is a two-way street. And so I would find myself in these scenarios where I'd been around the guys for, I filmed from 2015 to 2018. So coming into year 3, I could understand what they were talking about. And I would basically say, so Justin, I'm just going to paraphrase that real quick. And I would say what he was saying in like untutored lay people language. And I would say, is that right? He'd say, yeah, actually. And I'd say, can you say that back to me?
Oh my God.
And he would feed it back to me.
I am stealing that strategy from you, because
This is like Brian and I's next pitch meeting. Is Brian going to be like, so here's what I'm hearing. Can you say that back to me? And then can you say that to them when we're on the call?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've often said things, I've like tried to digest things from Justin and Laurent, and then I've repeated it, and then Laurent will go, oh, that's really well said. And I was like, oh, and so it's very much the same thing, just less consciously and purposefully, where, it comes out of their heads and then gets reflected back, and they're like, oh, that's a better way of saying it. I think we had a practicing safe sex session talking about simulation. I lost count of how many times Laurent said simulacra. Or simulacra, or simulation of simulacra, simulating like it got so meta that like he lost count of where he was. But at the same time, like it was effectively communicating something if you could keep up. But because you didn't have a chart and a diagram, that was a very small audience that he was not in.
Yeah, I think if you had been, if I'd had a crew and there was some behind the scenes making of footage of me listening to people going on, there would have been a whole lot of like, no, like, come on, you guys, like this again, anthropomorphic agony. What's a promiscuous?
Oh, from Laurent's book, anthropomorphic promiscuity.
No.
Anthropomorphic promiscuity and sociographic prudery.
Yeah,
those are the two-dimensional axes that Laurent uses to explain like
dimensional
religions.
axes. No.
And he like all the time he's like, oh, we'll throw it in here. And I was like, Laurent, nobody understands what you're talking about. He was like, you understand what you're talking about. I was like, this isn't about me.
I am not an untutored lay person.
That's right.
Isn't a dimensional axis a paradox? Like, isn't an axis something that's, I'm just thinking of an axis.
Axes.
And dimensional being anyway.
Yeah.
That one's just
so he has the two of them. That's what they are. That's how academic it got. That was his book, Theology After the Birth of God. It was like his 9th book or something like that. I reviewed that book actually before I started working with him, however you want to put it. Technically, I was working for him on this project. And I reviewed that book, and I actually had kind of taken it to task. I was happy with about half of it, and then said like the other half of this book doesn't actually exist.
Yeah. So my strategy for providing feedback on Chantal's thesis, fellowship applications, and so on, is I just gave her access to our AI writing tool, and then said, go use that. And she threw in one of her fellowship proposals and literally just told the AI, write a conclusion paragraph for this research statement. And we didn't make any edits. It was perfect. And then also like explain it to a 5-year-old is a really great setting. So Jen, back to the film. What is your vision for the film? What is your highest intention for, after a successful crowdfunding campaign, going through and doing all the visual polishing, protecting it as you mentioned, but what's your highest intention for it out in the world?
Yeah, well, like I said before, I really think that this is an interesting story that raises a lot of questions and can facilitate a lot of juicy discussions. So we want to attract as large of an audience as we possibly can for a relatively technical, super intellectual, kind of sci-fi themed doc that touches on some humanitarian issues that people are seeing in the news, refugees, terrorism, alienated second generation immigrants, hostilities, populism. There's a lot of really provocative topics that we touch on. And so I think it could be well received, somewhat controversially received at times, if we're able to achieve a television broadcast on possibly something like PBS would be the dream in the United States. It's a little easier to get on broadcast in European countries because they're more receptive to independent film and kind of obscure sciencey topics. And then, so in indie film, usually the most feasible distribution model is to pursue what's called hybrid distribution, where you seek rights to do basically a couple different rounds of releasing the film. So the first round of releasing the film is always to the film festival circuit. So we'll be submitting the film to the top tier of documentary film festivals all over the world. And there are about 10 or 12 documentary film festivals that would be really dreamy to screen at. And it's through the film festival circuit that films usually get noticed by sales agents, propose to the film team and the producers that the film be shopped to distribution avenues. So those avenues for us, we would aim for, not for theatrical exhibition, definitely not, that's not our market, but broadcast to some channels that are, specifically interested in social science and tech stories, stories about technological innovation. And then we'll chase after possible television broadcasts, we'll chase after selling rights to a streaming platform. But we'll also be doing some independent distribution, which will come in the form of probably doing individual screenings at universities, facilitating small group discussions. Yep. The scientists portrayed in the film will at that point be free to show the films through their own organizations and at their own universities. And probably ultimately we will seek educational distribution, which is placement in university libraries, and to encourage professors of courses in tech, simulation, complexity, humanitarian issues, innovative solutions to humanitarian crises to incorporate the film as part of their syllabi for their courses. So I think the film has possible, pretty broad and colorful future. And usually with indie film, you have to follow a film in its multi-dimensional distribution journey for a few different years. So we expect to be living with the film for a long time to come. And that was one of my big lessons as a filmmaker is I think I loved working on this film. It was a huge creative challenge, a big intellectual challenge, big narrative challenge. And I'm ambitious enough that I recognized it as an opportunity to sort of use it as a platform for my own career growth and also use it as a learning project to be like, well, I've made a lot of documentaries about interesting topics, but I always put them up on Vimeo for free or use them as teaching tools in my own classroom. But I want to give this one a real shot at something bigger and broader and to hit, a broader audience. So it's been a good learning project in terms of learning the ropes of indie film distribution and the film festival circuit, and just the whole workflow from soup to nuts of filming to finishing to releasing is really complicated and expensive. So I think that one big takeaway for me as a professional is rather than saying, yes, I can do that, I will take this job if it's paid no matter what, I will think, Jen, you lived with this movie for it'll probably be about 10 years in the end. And, you know, choose your topics wisely. I would choose this one again, but it's been a strategic communications challenge to tell the story. I definitely have had kind of like darker moments where I was like, oh man, this is so technical. It's boring. It's hard, you know, like, it doesn't sell itself. Right.
I mean,
I've had to really rise to
where's
the
the
occasion.
action, right? I mean,
Yeah, this
there
is
was
the
times
action.
where I'm just sitting in front of a computer. Jen came into the office once when I was still in Boston, and she was like, "I'm here to get footage of what you do," and I was like, "Oh, hold on, let me get out my good chair." like you know, I'm just sitting for 12 hours a day in front of this computer. I mean, the computer looked cool though, so we did get really good footage of the computer, and I was able to find some of the simulations that we were working on that had interesting visuals, where we can kind of manipulate them and try and tell the story so that people understand what these models are doing, and what we're looking at and what this doing. But otherwise, like, it's not that interesting to watch a guy code in raw Java for hours on end, and that was most of my job, like for those years, is it was just me in front of a computer writing Java for hours and hours on end, and then testing the model and then doing stats and that sort of a thing. So every once in a while I'd get up and do a little conference thing where I'd put on a collared shirt, and depending on as the movie depicts, painfully, depending on how close that conference was to where my wife lived, I may or may not have shaved or trimmed my beard. There are times, there's pictures that Jen has sent me where like my beard is just straight Santa Claus style. It's like it's all the way down to here, and then there's other times where it's like kind of trimmed like this, and you can tell because they're the ones where it was when we were in Lesbos or something, and my wife was there, so my hair was nice and trimmed and stuff like that. But if it was 6 months had gone by or whatever, a few months had gone by and I hadn't seen her, then my hair would just be really long and shaggy, and I just looked like the homeless professor.
That was me throughout quarantine, as I'm sure it was for most people.
Did she try and capture the love story between you and your rubber ducky?
No. That's for the director's cut.
Jen, one of the things that just popped in my mind was a priest, a rabbi, and a monk walk into a screening of your film. Yeah, no, but seriously, hosting a multi-religious leader collective screening followed by a panel afterwards would be a very, very interesting conversation to create and stream. And then secondarily, one of the things that hasn't been mentioned, which I'm sure you're aware of, is Justin's project, which I think is now currently called Cloud Comfort, which is the generative AI religious leaders that were created from the world's largest database of religious sermons that he created in your master's work.
It was in between master's and PhD, yeah.
Yeah,
it continued through the PhD and afterwards as well. Yeah.
Having that as an installation at the screening would be an awesome way of marketing the film as well.
Jen, I don't know if you've even seen that. It's at cloudcomfort.ai.
Nope, I haven't, but I will now.
Yeah, take a look at that. I created AI religious leaders that give teachings on different subjects. There's a Christian one, and then there's like a spiritual, which is basically just Western Buddhism.
Oh yes, right. Okay.
Which I would just like to read a passage from the Buddha bot.
Yeah, that's right.
Justin, it went online, so he added all the training data, and then it went online, and he asked it, "What is enlightenment?" And it responded, "Enlightenment is not to be a matter of feeling; it is a matter of knowing. For with knowing there is no meaning, and there can be no being. In Zen, there is no distinction between knower and known. When you are familiar with the way that there is no end, there is no necessity for anything to be continued."
And that's what AI thinks enlightenment is. The crazy one was when I trained the same thing on all of the sermons of Jim Jones, and I created an artificial Jim Jones and asked it, what is death? That was one of the scariest answers from AI that I've ever given, or that I've ever been given.
What did it? Yeah.
The answer, I'll have to I'll have to dig up the answer and give it to you and read it to you guys. It might actually, I might have it written down here. Hold on. I'll take a look at it, or a look for it here, because I know I have like the first time that it ever like gave a sermon or gave a teaching. But I think part of it is that I never released the Jim Jones one because I was like, talk about an ethical fiasco.
Yeah.
But what was interesting is that with the What is Death one, it wasn't actually taken from the Jonestown death sermon, which is what I expected the AI would do, is just kind of like take it from that last White Knight sermon where everybody killed themselves in that cult. And that's not actually what ended up happening. So that was an interesting one. I will find it.
We're nearing the end of time, so I want to be conscious of that. Jen, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us, for dedicating nearly a decade to this film and communicating.
Not yet, 6.5 so far, but I think seeing it through distribution and then finally getting it out of my hair, it'll push 10.
For every day spent trying not to go a little bit batty, listening to Justin and Laron, and being patient with them and prompting them to simplify is helpful, because the more that people come to understand the power of systems like this, because there are many, the more that we can begin to trust in them. And there's so many different possibilities when something like that happens, when people especially overcome fear to try and understand something that they didn't previously, so that they can, at least have an educated perspective on something that they didn't previously know. So thank you for that, and excited to promote the film. Definitely going to send a few messages to see what we can do to help.
The crowdfunding campaign for a second? Do you mind if I plug the crowdfunding campaign for a second?
Please do. It's already linked in the chat.
So, okay, good. So I want to ask any of our listeners to go to www.srvfilmsupport.com, SRV for Simulating Religious Violence. We are working on raising $35,000 in 1 month. We've got 2 weeks to go, and we're at 25,000 or so, 24,800. So we've got 10,000 more clams to rake on in. And that money, every single cent, will be spent on the variety of costs involved in releasing independent film if you have an ambitious distribution vision. And by ambitious, I simply mean not putting it up on YouTube for free. It gets expensive really fast. So we realize that crowdfunding is not just about fundraising, it's also about audience building. So this is the beginning of recruiting people to be interested in this movie and getting the word out and practicing our strategic communications about the art of simulation and the art of quantifying society and mathematically expressing relationships between different social factors, and the art of developing technological innovation that can alleviate humanitarian crises. And the great question of, can we take specialized research out of the ivory tower and make the world a better place with it? And what does that mean? And the great question of, am I going to die in an effing terrorist attack? And who's doing something about that?
Yeah, we are.
We are. If that makes them feel better or not is an open question.
Yeah, right. So if you're listening, please do go to srvfilmsupport.com and make a pledge for us. This week, actually, I should say, we're having a sweepstakes. If you pledge to our campaign, you get entered in a raffle to win these gorgeous handcrafts made by refugees on the island of Lesbos, where we filmed part of the film. Made upcycled life jackets, actually, made into beautiful bags. So we're raffling off 5 of these gorgeous bags, and pledges of any amount starting at $5 will be entered to win. So please, please, please come and support your independent filmmaker for science storytelling.
So amazing. Thank you so much again, Jen. And we will be propping the film and can't wait to watch it in full form.
Thank you. Great.
All right. We're going to end this stream and then end our recording.
Laron also said he's sorry because I sent him a message that was like, "Hey, are you jumping in?" And he sent me a message that was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna be there in a couple minutes so that I can like get Jen and walk her north to where we normally meet." And I was like, "No, you're not." It's like, we're about to end. It's already been going for an hour. And he was like, "What?" He did not realize
This
that
man can't be trusted with a computer.
this is why he's not the computer one between the two of us. He keeps all of his stuff like in a paper diary. So when the time zones reset in America, he was expecting this to still be at 8 p.m. Central European time.
Darn.
So he was like just getting ready to like sit down with his tea at his computer this evening and sign in.
Aw.
Jen, have you explored any metaverse distribution for your film?
I have not, but I would welcome that conversation. This is my first time dealing with any metaverse anything, so I'm wide open to thinking more about that.
Yeah, I've been spending the past couple of years focused on building an audience on various metaverse tools, and have quite a large audience now. Yeah, so
How do I find you? Your name is Elise at T-Let T?
Yeah, T-Let T, that's my handle for Twitch and YouTube and all of that. But yeah, I mean, of course, email. At the end of the day, email is always king. So if we can get in touch that way, I'll send you a message here.
Awesome.
And yeah, there's ways of making money like micropayments. So
Great.
it's interesting.
I'd love to learn more from you about the
I'd love
metaverse.
to help you. And I think it would be in harmony with the content matter of your
Hey Siri, off.
documentary as well.
Yeah, great. Are you okay? T-Let T. I'll start
Yeah.
looking around for you.
Yeah. Twitter too. You can message me on Twitter that way. I don't know if you're
Okay.
in the Twitter.
I have her
And-
email too, Jen. So if worst comes to
Oh,
worst and you can't remember it,
okay.
send me a text or something, and I'll text you her email and stuff.
Okay, sounds great.
And Jen, I sent you a link on in LinkedIn with my email as well. We have
okay.
a few members in our community. I'm going to